Hello guys, how are you? Today we will explain and review Lee Cronin's The Mummy, 2026, full movie. Part by part. Part 1: The horror that should have stayed buried. There are horror movies. And then there are horror films that feel disturbingly real. Stories that don't rely only on monsters hiding in the shadows, but instead force audiences to confront something much more terrifying. The fear of losing someone you love, and the horror of getting them back. Changed. In 2026, horror filmmaker Lee Cronin brought a completely new nightmare into the world with The Mummy. But this wasn't the ancient Egyptian adventure many audiences expected. No treasure hunters. No heroic action scenes. No glamorous curses hidden beneath giant pyramids. Instead, Lee Cronin transformed The Mummy into something darker. More personal. More disturbing. A psychological, supernatural horror story about grief, loss, and the terrifying cost of bringing back what should never return. At the center of this nightmare is a family destroyed by tragedy. A daughter disappears. Years pass. Hope dies. And then, against every rule of reality, she suddenly comes back. Alive. But something feels wrong. Deeply wrong. Because the girl who returned may no longer be human, and what begins as a miracle slowly transforms into pure horror. But here's the terrifying question. What if this story isn't really about resurrection? What if The Mummy is secretly about obsession, guilt, and the terrifying truth that some wounds can never heal? Today, we're diving deep into everything surrounding Lee Cronin's The Mummy, 2026. Its terrifying story, its hidden horror, its disturbing symbolism, its psychological themes, and why this version of The Mummy may become one of the darkest horror reimaginings in modern cinema. Because sometimes, the scariest monsters don't come from ancient tombs. They come back home. Chapter 1: The Rebirth of a Horror Legend. For decades, the word The Mummy meant one thing: ancient curses, deserts, tombs, adventure. Classic Hollywood mythology. From old Universal monsters to blockbuster action films, the franchise had become associated with excitement and spectacle. But Lee Cronin had different plans, and that decision alone changed everything. Rather than repeating familiar ideas, Cronin reportedly reimagined The Mummy as grounded horror, intimate horror, emotional horror. The kind of story that crawls under your skin rather than jumping out at you. That creative choice instantly separated this film from earlier interpretations. Because this version asks a terrifying question. What if the curse doesn't awaken in a tomb, but inside a family? What if the monster isn't chasing strangers, but living inside your house? And suddenly, the fear becomes personal. Much more personal. That's what makes this concept terrifying. The horror doesn't happen in some distant ancient location. It happens at home, where you sleep, where you trust people, where love exists. And that emotional closeness makes everything feel worse. Because unlike ancient adventure films, this story weaponizes emotional attachment. You care about the daughter. You understand the parents. You want things to return to normal. But horror stories punish hope. And this film seems determined to do exactly that. Chapter 2: The Disappearance That Destroyed Everything. Every nightmare begins with loss. And in The Mummy, that loss arrives through disappearance. A young girl vanishes into the desert. No answers. No body. No explanation. Just silence. And silence is sometimes more terrifying than death. Because death gives closure. Disappearance creates endless torture. Families never stop wondering. Never stop searching. Never stop imagining impossible scenarios. Is she alive? Did someone take her? Could she still come back? This uncertainty destroys people psychologically. And that emotional suffering becomes the foundation of horror. Because by the time years pass, the family is already broken. Hope has become painful. Grief has turned into survival. Life continues. But emotionally, time stopped. And then, everything changes. Without warning, the impossible happens. The daughter returns. Alive. 8 years later. No explanation. No logical answer. Just sudden reappearance. And at first, that moment feels miraculous. A dream. A second chance. A family reunited. But horror stories understand one terrifying truth. Miracles often come with consequences. And very quickly, the celebration begins to rot. Something feels off. The daughter isn't the same. Her behavior changes. Her presence feels wrong. And worst of all, the family begins to realize something terrifying. Maybe she never truly came back. Maybe something else did. Chapter 3. The most terrifying horror concept. What makes the mummy so disturbing isn't ancient monsters. It's emotional confusion. Imagine this. Someone you lost suddenly returns. The person you cried over. The person you buried emotionally. The person you spent years missing. They're standing in front of you again. Would you question it? Or would love blind you? That's the terrifying psychological trap of this story. Because even if something feels wrong, you don't want to believe it. You can't believe it. Not after suffering so much. Grief changes people. And grief makes people vulnerable, desperate, easy to manipulate. That emotional desperation becomes horror fuel. The family wants their daughter back so badly that they may ignore obvious danger. And audiences watching experience something horrifying. You know something is wrong, but emotionally, you understand why the family refuses to see it. That emotional conflict creates tension, because fear and hope are fighting each other, and horror becomes inevitable. Chapter 4. What does the mummy really mean? Traditionally, a mummy means preserved death. Something buried, but not gone. Something ancient, waiting. But Lee Cronin's version appears to transform the concept entirely. The daughter herself becomes symbolic. Preserved trauma. Preserved grief. Preserved suffering. She disappeared, but emotionally, she never left. The family stayed trapped in her memory. Frozen. Unable to heal. Unable to move on. And when she returns, the emotional wound literally comes back to life. That idea is terrifying. Because suddenly, the mummy isn't only physical. It's emotional.
The dark truth behind the returned child. Imagine losing someone you love, not through death, not through goodbye, but through disappearance. One ordinary moment, they exist. The next, they're simply gone. No answers, no closure, no final memory to hold on to. Just endless waiting, an unbearable silence that slowly destroys everything. Days become months, months become years. Hope turns into pain, memories become torture, and eventually, you stop asking whether they'll come back, because surviving disappointment becomes easier than believing. But then, against every law of reality, the impossible happens. The person you lost returns, alive, standing in front of you, breathing, looking at you, calling you family. At first, it feels like a miracle, the greatest miracle imaginable. But then, something changes. Their eyes feel unfamiliar. Their behavior becomes strange. Their presence feels heavy, cold, wrong. And slowly, a terrifying thought begins crawling into your mind. What if this isn't really them? What if the thing that came back only looks like the person you lost? In 2026, director Lee Cronin took one of horror's oldest monsters and turned it into something deeply disturbing. Not a story about explorers, not a story about tombs, not even a story about ancient treasure. Instead, the mummy became something horrifyingly personal. A nightmare about family, grief, transformation, and the terrifying cost of refusing to bury the past. Because this story asks one devastating question. If someone you loved returned, would you recognize the moment they stopped being human? Tonight, we uncover the dark truth behind The Mummy, 2026. Its hidden psychological horror, its disturbing emotional themes, its terrifying symbolism, and why this may secretly be one of the darkest family horror stories in years. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't death. It's watching someone return. Different. Chapter 1. The disappearance that destroyed a family. Every horror story begins with a wound. Something breaks. Something is taken. Something changes forever. And in The Mummy, 2026, that wound arrives through disappearance. A young daughter vanishes into the desert. No explanation. No evidence. No goodbye. One moment, she exists. The next, she becomes memory. And memory is cruel. Because memory never stays still. It changes, distorts, becomes painful. For parents, losing a child is one of the most psychologically devastating experiences imaginable. But disappearance creates a different kind of suffering. Death provides certainty. Disappearance provides torture. Because certainty allows grief. Uncertainty traps grief forever. The family doesn't know what happened. Was she kidnapped? Lost? Dead? Still alive somewhere? Did she suffer? Did she cry for help? Did someone fail her? These questions become permanent, and permanent questions destroy people. Because humans need answers. Without answers, the mind creates horror of its own. Every phone call becomes possibility. Every stranger becomes suspicion. Every year becomes heavier. And over time, the family stops living. They simply continue existing. Broken. Waiting. Haunted. Because losing someone changes a house. Rooms feel emptier. Silence grows louder. Memories become unbearable. A bedroom becomes sacred. Untouched. Frozen in time. A reminder of someone who may never return. That emotional devastation matters. Because before the supernatural begins, the family is already emotionally destroyed. And broken people often make dangerous choices. Chapter 2. Why the return feels wrong. Then suddenly, the impossible happens. After 8 years, the daughter comes back. Alive. No explanation. No rescue story. No logical reason. Just return. Imagine that moment. A knock at the door. A phone call. A face you thought you'd never see again. The child you buried emotionally. Standing there. Older. Changed. But alive. Most families would collapse emotionally. Tears. Shock. Relief. Disbelief. The impossible dream has happened. But horror films understand something terrifying. Sometimes miracles feel unnatural. Because reality rarely gives back what it takes. Especially after years. And that discomfort becomes central to The Mummy. The daughter returns. But she doesn't feel right. Not immediately terrifying. Not openly dangerous. Just wrong. And wrongness is powerful horror. Because audiences understand it instinctively. Humans notice subtle changes. Especially in loved ones. The way someone laughs. The way they speak. The rhythm of their voice. The emotion in their eyes. And when familiarity disappears, fear quietly enters the room. Maybe she stares too long. Maybe she behaves strangely. Maybe ordinary human interactions confuse her. Maybe she remembers things incorrectly. Or worse, maybe she remembers things she shouldn't. And suddenly, the family faces a terrifying emotional conflict. Ignore the fear, or accept an unbearable possibility. The child they missed may no longer truly exist. Chapter 3: When Love Becomes Blindness. One of the darkest ideas inside The Mummy may be the danger of unconditional love, because love can blind people, especially grief-driven love. Think about it. If someone you loved disappeared for 8 years, would you question their return? Or would emotion overpower logic? That's what makes this premise terrifying. The family wants this miracle to be real. They need it to be real. Emotionally, their survival depends on it. Because if she isn't truly back, then everything collapses again. And human beings are experts at denial. We ignore warning signs. We rationalize danger. We excuse disturbing behavior. Because truth sometimes hurts too much. That emotional blindness creates horror. The family may notice warning signs, but choose not to act. Because accepting reality means grieving all over again. And grief twice can destroy people. So instead, they pretend everything is okay. Pretend the strange behavior means trauma. Pretend the silence means healing. Pretend the coldness means emotional damage. Pretend the fear isn't real. Until pretending becomes impossible. And by then, it may already be too late. Chapter 4: The Real Meaning of The Mummy. Most audiences hear the word mummy and think of wrapped monsters, ancient Egypt, curses, tombs. But what if Lee Cronin transformed the meaning completely? Because emotionally, a mummy represents preservation. Something dead, refusing to disappear. Something ancient, still existing. Something buried, returning. Part 3: The Psychological Horror Behind the Returned Daughter. There is something deeply terrifying about getting back something you already lost. Not because happiness is frightening, but because sometimes what returns is no longer the same. Horror has always understood this fear. The fear that love can blind us. The fear that grief can reshape reality. And perhaps most terrifying of all, the fear that the people we miss the most may become the very thing that destroys us. In 2026, Lee Cronin's The Mummy arrived not as a grand action-adventure spectacle, but as something colder, darker, far more intimate, a supernatural horror story disguised as family tragedy. At first glance, the premise sounds impossible. A young girl disappears into the desert without a trace. Years pass. Her family suffers. Their lives collapse under grief. Then suddenly, 8 years later, she comes back. Alive. No explanation. No warning. No answers. Only a miracle. Or at least, something pretending to be one. Because very quickly, that miracle begins to decay. The daughter doesn't feel normal. Her behavior changes. Something ancient seems to exist beneath her skin. And slowly, the family realizes a horrifying possibility. The child they prayed would come home may never have truly returned. Tonight, we are diving into one of the darkest interpretations of the Mummy ever imagined. Not through mythology alone, but through psychology, because beneath the supernatural horror, this film may secretly tell a devastating story about grief, denial, trauma, and what happens when human beings refuse to let go. Because sometimes, the dead don't return, only our guilt does. Chapter 1. A family already broken. Every horror story begins before the monster arrives. That's important, because the greatest horror films understand one brutal truth. People are often already emotionally broken before evil enters their lives. And The Mummy, 2026, appears built entirely around this idea. Before the supernatural begins, there is tragedy. A child disappears. Gone. Without warning. Without evidence. Without closure. And closure matters. Psychologists often describe unresolved loss as one of the most painful emotional experiences a human being can endure. Because the mind cannot accept uncertainty. It keeps searching, keeps replaying memories, keeps asking impossible questions. What happened? Could things have gone differently? Was there something we missed? Did we fail them? For the family in The Mummy, this grief likely becomes permanent, not healing grief, not acceptance, but frozen grief, the kind that traps people emotionally, the kind that turns homes into museums of memory. Maybe the parents stop talking to each other. Maybe blame enters the relationship. Maybe silence becomes louder than conversation. Maybe every birthday becomes torture. Every photograph becomes painful. Every empty chair feels haunted. And over time, the family survives, but never truly lives again. That emotional destruction is critical to understanding the horror. Because by the time the daughter returns, this isn't a healthy family. This is a family desperate for salvation. And desperation changes people. Desperation makes impossible things believable. Even dangerous things. Especially dangerous things. Chapter 2. Why the return is actually terrifying. Most films would treat this moment as beautiful. A reunion. A miracle. An emotional triumph. Imagine it. The missing daughter walks back into their lives. Older. Changed. But alive. Tears. Shock. Relief. The impossible has happened. But horror stories know something important. Miracles are suspicious. Because real life rarely gives people exactly what they want. Especially after years of suffering. And that's what makes the reunion terrifying. Not because something horrible immediately happens, but because audiences instinctively know something is wrong. The timing feels impossible. The circumstances make no sense. Questions appear instantly. Where has she been? Who kept her alive? Why now? Why return after 8 years? And perhaps the darkest question, is this even really her? Because horror thrives in uncertainty. Fear grows strongest when answers disappear. And Lee Cronin's version of the mummy appears obsessed with uncertainty. Instead of immediate terror, the film reportedly leans into discomfort. Small details, unnatural behavior, something slightly wrong, tiny moments that feel impossible to explain. The daughter stares too long, speaks strangely, moves differently, feels emotionally distant, not evil, not immediately dangerous, just wrong. And that kind of horror is deeply unsettling, because humans are experts at noticing subtle differences, especially in loved ones. Parents recognize tiny behavioral shifts instantly. The way someone speaks, walks, smiles, looks at people, and when those familiar patterns disappear, the human brain notices, even if it cannot explain why. That discomfort slowly becomes fear, because the family wants to believe. But belief becomes harder every day. Chapter 3: Grief as a Monster. What if the mummy isn't really about a curse? What if it's about grief itself? Think about it. Grief behaves like haunting. It lingers, returns unexpectedly, changes people, destroys relationships, makes ordinary places feel painful, turns memory into suffering. In many ways, grief already acts like a supernatural force, and the mummy may weaponize that emotional reality. The daughter becomes more than a character. She becomes living grief, a reminder of pain, a wound reopening. The family spent years trying to survive her absence. Now they must survive her presence. And strangely, that might be harder, because absence creates longing, presence creates truth. If she's changed, if something evil exists inside her, then the family must confront something horrifying. The person they missed may already be gone, and accepting that possibility means experiencing loss all over again. Only this time, it's worse, because now they must watch her disappear, while standing right in front of them. That emotional devastation could become the true horror engine of the movie. Not jump scares, not monsters, but heartbreak. The unbearable horror of realizing love cannot fix everything. Chapter 4: Why body horror feels so disturbing. Transformation has always terrified human beings, because identity feels fragile. We trust faces, voices, behavior, familiarity. Part 4. Ancient Curse, Desert Horror and the Terrifying Myth Behind the Return. Some stories begin with evil. Others begin with tragedy. But the most terrifying horror stories begin with mystery. Because mystery creates obsession. And obsession has a terrifying habit of awakening things better left untouched. For thousands of years, human civilization has feared one idea more than almost anything else: the return of the dead. Ancient cultures feared it. Religions warned about it. Myths were built around it. Because humanity has always believed, when something buried returns, it never comes back unchanged. And in 2026, director Lee Cronin transformed one of cinema's oldest horror legends into something much darker, much colder, and infinitely more disturbing: The Mummy. But this time, there are no adventurous heroes racing through giant tombs, no action spectacle, no treasure hunting, no heroic fantasy. Instead, the horror comes home. A young daughter disappears into the desert, gone without explanation, lost for years, believed gone forever. Then, against every law of reality, she suddenly returns, alive. But something ancient, something horrifying, appears to have returned with her, because the miracle of reunion soon becomes a nightmare. The child feels different, unnatural, as if something impossible survived inside her. And slowly, the family begins realizing a terrifying truth. Maybe the desert never gave their daughter back. Maybe it only borrowed her. Tonight, we uncover the ancient horror hidden inside The Mummy, 2026. Its terrifying mythology, its psychological darkness, its disturbing symbolism, and why this version of The Mummy may secretly be one of the bleakest horror stories modern audiences have ever seen. Because some curses don't begin in tombs, they begin in grief. Chapter 1. Why the desert is the perfect horror location. Before understanding the monster, we need to understand the setting, because great horror films use location as psychology. And in The Mummy, the desert may be the first monster. Think about deserts for a moment. They are places of silence, places where sound disappears, places where life struggles to survive. Endless emptiness, endless heat, endless isolation. There are few environments more terrifying than somewhere vast enough to erase you completely. People vanish in deserts. Civilizations disappear. Secrets remain hidden beneath sand for centuries. And perhaps most frightening of all, deserts preserve. Bodies survive there. History survives there. Death survives there. Ancient things remain untouched, waiting, sleeping, hidden beneath time itself. That symbolism matters, because the daughter doesn't disappear into a city. She disappears into something timeless, something ancient, something unknowable. The desert becomes almost mythological, a place between life and death, reality and nightmare, human civilization and forgotten horror. And after 8 years, the desert gives something back. But horror stories understand one terrifying truth: nature never returns things unchanged. Especially after years, something survives there. Something transforms. Something waits. And whatever waited may now be coming home. Chapter 2. The Fear of the Returned Child. Few horror concepts are more disturbing than a child returning home different, because children represent innocence, safety, hope. Families build emotional worlds around them. Parents sacrifice everything for them, protect them, love them, dream for them. So when innocence becomes horror, the emotional damage becomes devastating. That's what makes The Mummy disturbing, because this isn't simply a monster movie. This is emotional horror. The family spent years grieving, years blaming themselves, years imagining impossible outcomes. Then suddenly, hope returns. Their daughter comes back. Alive, breathing, speaking, existing. At first, it feels like salvation, the impossible miracle they dreamed about. But gradually, something feels wrong. Maybe she stares too long. Maybe ordinary human interaction feels unfamiliar to her. Maybe her voice feels emotionally distant. Maybe she remembers details incorrectly. Or perhaps, she remembers things nobody should know. That discomfort becomes horrifying because audiences understand it instantly. Humans recognize familiarity. We know the tiny details that make loved ones feel real. Parents especially. A small change in behavior feels enormous. And when enough small differences begin appearing, love turns into fear. But fear creates guilt. Because how do you fear someone you spent years praying for? How do you doubt a miracle? How do you question your own child? That emotional contradiction becomes unbearable. And horror grows stronger. Chapter 3. What if this isn't possession? Many horror films explain strange behavior through possession. A demon enters. A spirit takes control. A curse infects someone. Simple. Easy. But The Mummy appears more disturbing than that. Because this may not be possession. This may be transformation. And transformation is infinitely more horrifying. Why? Because possession suggests separation. It suggests the real person still exists underneath. Still savable. Still waiting. Transformation is crueler. Transformation means change. Permanent change. It asks a devastating question. What if the person you loved is slowly disappearing, without ever fully leaving? Imagine watching someone familiar become unfamiliar. Slowly, painfully, every day, a little colder, a little stranger, a little more distant, until eventually, you're forced to ask the impossible question. How much of them still remains? That emotional horror destroys families. Because love creates denial. The family may keep searching for pieces of the daughter they remember. Moments of familiarity. A smile. A memory. A sentence that sounds normal. Tiny proof she's still there. But horror thrives in false hope. And sometimes, hope becomes the cruelest punishment of all. Chapter 4. The Ancient Fear of Burial. Human beings have always feared burial. Not death. Burial. Because burial means separation. Finality. The moment something disappears beneath the earth forever. Ancient civilizations feared disturbing graves for one reason. They believed death should remain undisturbed. The boundary mattered. Living people belonged above. Dead people belonged below. Crossing that line invited consequences. And The Mummy may secretly revolve around violating this rule. The daughter disappeared. Emotionally, she was buried. Not physically, but psychologically. The family suffered, grieved, Part 6: Hidden Details, Dark Symbolism, and the Horror You Didn't Notice. The scariest horror stories are rarely about what we immediately see. Real horror hides beneath the surface. Inside silence, inside symbolism, inside details most audiences overlook. Because sometimes the true monster isn't obvious. Sometimes the horror is hidden inside meaning. And in 2026, director Lee Cronin appears to have transformed The Mummy into exactly that kind of nightmare. A horror story layered with emotional symbolism, psychological fear, family trauma, and hidden meanings buried beneath grief. At first glance, the premise feels simple. A daughter disappears into the desert. Years pass. Her family collapses under sorrow. Then suddenly, against all logic, she comes back, alive. But something isn't right. The child who returned feels different, unnatural, almost as if something impossible followed her home. And slowly, the miracle becomes terrifying. But what if The Mummy, 2026, isn't really about resurrection? What if this entire story secretly represents something much darker? What if the desert, the disappearance, the transformation, and even the title itself are symbols for emotional suffering? Tonight, we are uncovering the hidden details and disturbing symbolism behind The Mummy, 2026. The emotional horror buried beneath the surface, the terrifying metaphors hiding in plain sight, and why this film may secretly be far darker than audiences expect. Because sometimes, the most dangerous things are the meanings we fail to notice. Chapter 1: The desert isn't just a location. Let's start with the most overlooked detail. The desert. At first, it simply feels like a setting, a place where the daughter disappears. But horror films rarely choose locations randomly, especially psychological horror, because environments often symbolize emotional states. And deserts represent emptiness, isolation, loss, spiritual death. Think about what deserts actually are. Massive spaces filled with silence, places where survival becomes difficult, places where people lose direction, places that erase certainty. And suddenly, the symbolism becomes terrifying, because emotionally, the family enters a psychological desert the moment their daughter disappears. Life becomes empty, cold, directionless. Hope evaporates. Time stretches endlessly. Emotionally, they become lost, just like someone trapped in endless sand. And perhaps most importantly, deserts preserve things. Bodies survive there. Ancient ruins survive there. History stays buried beneath the surface, waiting, unchanged. That detail matters, because emotionally, the family preserves grief. They never move on, never heal, never truly bury loss. Instead, pain remains untouched, frozen in time, waiting, just like something buried beneath sand. And when the daughter returns, it almost feels symbolic, like buried suffering has suddenly resurfaced, not healed, not gone, returned. And that idea alone feels terrifying, because buried pain rarely returns peacefully. Chapter 2: The daughter may symbolize trauma itself. Here's where things become disturbing. What if the daughter represents more than a person? What if she symbolizes trauma? Think about trauma for a moment. Trauma disappears, but never truly leaves. People bury it, avoid it, hide from it, pretend they've moved on. But deep down, it waits, silent, dormant, until one day, It returns. Suddenly. Violently. Unexpectedly. And when trauma resurfaces, it rarely looks familiar. It changes people. Makes ordinary life feel threatening. Turns homes uncomfortable. Changes relationships. Destroys emotional stability. Now think about the daughter's return. She comes back, but feels different, cold, wrong, unfamiliar, almost as if something invisible changed her. That mirrors trauma perfectly, because unresolved pain always returns altered. And perhaps, the family's inability to confront grief becomes the real horror. Maybe they never emotionally accepted loss. Maybe they froze themselves emotionally. Maybe they spent years surviving, instead of healing. And now, their buried suffering has returned physically, standing in front of them, demanding attention, demanding truth, demanding confrontation. That symbolism transforms the mummy into something devastating, because suddenly, the horror isn't supernatural. It's emotional. Chapter 3. Why 8 years matters. One small detail audiences might overlook. The timeline. 8 years. Why 8? Because in storytelling, time matters. Specific numbers often carry symbolic meaning. 8 years is long enough for hope to die. Long enough for grief to become permanent. Long enough for families to emotionally fracture. Long enough for identity to change. Think about it. After 8 years, parents stop expecting miracles. Friends move on. Communities forget. The missing child becomes memory. A photograph. A tragedy people whisper about. Emotionally, the family begins adapting to absence. Not healing. Adapting. And then suddenly, everything collapses again. The daughter returns. But because so much time passed, she almost feels like a stranger. That emotional distance creates fear. Because grief already changed everyone. The parents changed. The house changed. Life changed. And now, someone from the past suddenly walks back into a future where they no longer fit. That emotional discomfort feels haunting, because sometimes, even miracles arrive too late. Chapter 4. The real meaning of The Mummy. Most audiences think the title means one thing: ancient monster, bandages, curses, Egyptian mythology. But what if the title secretly means something emotional? Because mummies represent preservation. Something dead, intentionally kept from decay. Something buried, but not gone. Something ancient, still existing beneath the surface. And suddenly, the symbolism becomes obvious. The family preserved grief, preserved memory, preserved pain. Emotionally, they turned loss into something permanent. They never let the daughter disappear emotionally. She remained alive inside the house, inside conversations, inside sadness, inside guilt. And when she returns, the preserved past literally walks back into their lives. But preserved things often decay in disturbing ways. That's what makes mummies frightening. They're reminders that time changes everything, even what survives. And perhaps, the daughter herself becomes symbolic of preserved pain. Part 5. A family horror tragedy that turns into pure nightmare. Some horror stories scare us because of monsters. Some terrify us because of violence. But the darkest horror stories, the ones that stay inside your head long after the credits end, terrify us for a different reason. Because they feel emotionally real. Because deep down, We understand them, we fear them, and perhaps nothing is more terrifying than losing someone you love, only to get them back changed. In 2026, director Lee Cronin transformed one of cinema's oldest horror names into something unexpectedly devastating: The Mummy. But forget everything audiences once associated with that title. No globe-trotting adventure. No giant action spectacle. No heroic treasure hunters running through collapsing tombs. This time, the horror feels personal, cold, intimate, painfully human. At the center of the story is a broken family. A daughter disappears into the desert. No answers, no rescue, no body, just absence. Years pass. Grief spreads through the family like disease. Hope dies. Life moves forward. But emotionally, nothing ever heals. Then suddenly, against every law of logic, their daughter returns, alive, standing in front of them, breathing, speaking, home. At first, it feels impossible, a miracle, a second chance, the nightmare finally over. But horror stories understand something humanity never wants to accept. Sometimes miracles carry darkness inside them, because slowly, the family realizes something horrifying. The child who returned doesn't feel like the daughter they lost. Her behavior changes. Her emotions feel distant. Something ancient, something deeply wrong, appears to exist beneath the surface. And what begins as a reunion slowly becomes tragedy. Tonight, we are diving deep into The Mummy, 2026, as a family horror story. A devastating tragedy about grief, loss, emotional destruction, and the terrifying truth that sometimes love alone cannot save the people we lose. Because the scariest thing about horror is not death. It's watching something you love disappear. Twice. Chapter 1. Before the horror, there was love. The greatest tragedies always begin with happiness. That matters, because loss only hurts when something meaningful existed first. And before The Mummy becomes horror, it likely begins as family life, ordinary life. Simple moments, conversations, laughter, arguments that don't matter, dinner tables, shared memories, the kind of everyday existence people rarely appreciate until it disappears. At the center of it all, a daughter, a child loved deeply, protected, cherished, the emotional heart of the family. Because children often become emotional gravity. Families revolve around them. Dreams form around them. The future depends on them. Parents sacrifice for them, live for them, worry for them. Love becomes automatic, instinctive, permanent, and perhaps that emotional closeness is exactly why the horror becomes unbearable. Because when tragedy arrives, it destroys more than happiness. It destroys identity. Parents stop knowing who they are. Families stop functioning normally. Ordinary life collapses. And suddenly, everything changes forever. Chapter 2. The day everything ended. Every family remembers the worst day of their lives. The moment everything changed. The moment time split into two parts, before and after. In The Mummy, 2026. That moment arrives through disappearance. The daughter vanishes into the desert. No warning, no explanation. One moment, she exists. The next, nothing, gone. And disappearance creates a uniquely horrifying kind of grief. Because death feels final, painful, but final. Disappearance creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is emotional torture, because the mind never stops searching for answers. Where did she go? What happened? Was she scared? Did she survive? Could someone have saved her? Did we fail her? These questions become permanent wounds, especially for parents, because parents often blame themselves, even unfairly, even irrationally. Guilt enters grief, and guilt spreads like poison. Maybe one parent blames the other. Maybe silence replaces communication. Maybe arguments become routine. Maybe hope becomes dangerous, because hope hurts after enough disappointment. And over time, the family begins emotionally collapsing. Not suddenly, slowly, quietly. The kind of destruction nobody notices immediately. Smiles disappear. Memories become painful. The house changes. Rooms feel emptier. Laughter disappears. The daughter's bedroom remains untouched, frozen, like a shrine to grief, because letting go feels impossible. And maybe that inability to let go becomes the first real curse of the story. Chapter 3. When the impossible returns. Then suddenly, everything changes. After years, the impossible happens. The daughter comes back. Alive. No explanation. No answers. Only shock. Imagine that moment. The knock at the door. The phone call. The face you thought you'd never see again. Standing there. Older. Changed. But alive. No parent could emotionally prepare for that moment. Relief crashes into confusion. Love overwhelms logic. Tears replace questions, because after years of suffering, you stop caring whether something makes sense. You only care that the nightmare is over. The child is home, finally home, and for a brief moment, maybe the family begins healing. Maybe hope returns. Maybe happiness becomes possible again. But horror films understand one terrifying truth. The longer happiness lasts, the worse tragedy becomes. Because slowly, tiny details begin feeling wrong. Small things, uncomfortable things, behavior changes, emotional distance, strange silences, coldness, a feeling that something familiar has disappeared. And familiarity matters. Humans recognize loved ones instinctively. Tiny behaviors matter. The way someone smiles, speaks, laughs, looks at people. And when those familiar things disappear, fear quietly begins growing. Not obvious fear, subtle fear. The kind that feels impossible to explain. The daughter looks the same, but something feels off, and nobody wants to say it aloud, because speaking fear makes it real, and reality may be unbearable. Chapter 4. The Horror of Denial. One of the darkest themes inside The Mummy may be denial, because denial protects people, at least temporarily, when reality hurts too much. Part 7 Ending Explained, Dark Theories and What Really Happened. The most terrifying horror endings are the ones that refuse to give clear answers, because uncertainty stays with us. It lingers. It grows. Long after the movie ends, the questions remain. What really happened? Who survived? What was real? What did we miss? And perhaps most importantly, was the horror ever truly over? That lingering uncertainty may become the darkest strength of Lee Cronin's The Mummy, 2026. Because this doesn't appear to be a simple monster story. This is psychological horror, family tragedy, emotional destruction, and hidden terror disguised as grief. At first, the story feels impossible. A daughter disappears into the desert, gone without explanation. Years pass. The family collapses under grief. Hope dies. Life changes. Then suddenly, against every law of reality, the impossible happens. The daughter returns. Alive. But something feels wrong. Cold. Unnatural. Her behavior changes. Her presence feels unfamiliar. And slowly, the miracle begins transforming into horror. But what if the ending of The Mummy means something much darker than audiences expect? What if the returned daughter isn't really the biggest mystery? What if the real horror lies inside the family itself? Tonight, we are breaking down The Mummy, 2026, ending, exploring hidden clues, psychological theories, ancient curse possibilities, and the terrifying truth behind what may have actually happened. Because sometimes, the scariest endings are the ones hiding in plain sight. Chapter 1. The biggest question. Did the real daughter return? Let's begin with the darkest question of all. Did the real daughter ever come back? At first, the answer feels obvious. Of course she returned. She looks the same, recognizes people, knows memories, calls them family. But horror stories love emotional deception. And emotional deception becomes strongest when grief gets involved. Because grief changes perception. People see what they want to see, especially after unbearable loss. Think about the parents for a moment. They spent years suffering, years wondering, years blaming themselves. Emotionally, they are desperate. Desperate for hope, desperate for healing, desperate for one impossible miracle. So when the daughter returns, would they question it? Probably not. Most people wouldn't. Emotion would overpower logic instantly. But horror thrives inside ignored details. Maybe she remembers too much. Maybe she remembers too little. Maybe familiar behavior disappears. Maybe emotional warmth feels missing. Maybe something ancient exists behind her eyes. And gradually, the horrifying possibility emerges. What if this isn't resurrection? What if this is replacement? Because mythology often warns humanity about one terrifying truth. When something lost returns, it rarely comes back unchanged. Maybe the daughter survived physically, but something transformed her. Or maybe something else came back wearing her memory. That theory alone becomes devastating. Because emotionally, the family finally gets what they wanted. But reality may be infinitely crueler. Chapter 2. Theory 1. The Desert Curse. Let's talk mythology. Because the Mummy title naturally raises one terrifying possibility. An ancient curse. The desert has always symbolized mystery. Civilizations vanished there. Secrets remained buried. Ancient beliefs survived beneath endless sand. And perhaps, the daughter accidentally awakened something ancient. Something old. Hungry. Forgotten. Maybe the desert never truly lost her. Maybe it kept her, changed her, preserved her, and eventually returned her. But not for free. This theory suggests something followed her home. Not possession. Not exactly. Something older. Something parasitic. Something that slowly consumes identity. That would explain why the daughter feels different. Why familiarity begins disappearing. Why fear slowly replaces love. And perhaps the transformation grows stronger over time, meaning the real horror begins after she returns, not before. Because ancient horror stories rarely end with escape. Escape only spreads the curse. And suddenly, the family home becomes the new tomb. Chapter 3, Theory 2. The horror is actually grief. Now let's explore a much darker possibility. What if the mummy isn't truly supernatural at all? What if the story secretly symbolizes grief? Think about it. Everything in the movie revolves around emotional suffering, loss, memory, trauma, absence, denial. The daughter disappears. The family emotionally breaks. Years pass. Pain becomes permanent. Then suddenly, the daughter returns. But she feels unfamiliar, different, disconnected. And that perfectly mirrors reality. Because grief changes memory. People often remember loved ones unrealistically, idealistically, emotionally frozen in time. But after 8 years, nobody stays the same. People evolve, change, become strangers. And perhaps the horror comes from emotional expectation. The family wants the old daughter back, the memory, the preserved version. But reality refuses. The returned daughter feels unfamiliar, not because she's evil, but because trauma destroyed emotional connection. That interpretation becomes devastating, because suddenly, the real monster becomes expectation, the inability to accept change, the impossibility of recreating the past. And maybe the horror comes from realizing some reunions cannot fix suffering. Chapter 4, Theory 3. The family created their own nightmare. Here's an even darker theory. What if the family accidentally becomes responsible for the horror? Not intentionally, emotionally. Think about it. The family spent years preserving grief, keeping memories alive, refusing emotional closure, holding on to hope, refusing acceptance, and emotionally, that creates obsession. What if their refusal to let go metaphorically summoned horror? Not magic, psychological destruction, because unresolved trauma destroys people, makes them paranoid, fearful, desperate, and desperation creates bad decisions. Maybe warning signs get ignored. Maybe reality becomes distorted. Maybe fear turns ordinary things monstrous. Or perhaps, their emotional dependence on the daughter becomes destructive. They stop seeing the real person. They only see memory. And when reality conflicts with memory, everything collapses. That interpretation feels terrifying. Because suddenly, nobody is innocent. The family isn't just victims. They're participants in tragedy. Part 8. Character Analysis, Hidden Motivations and the Psychology of Fear. Every great horror story pretends to be about monsters, but if you look closer, the monster is rarely the real focus. The real story is always about people, their fears, their guilt, their secrets, their emotional collapse. Because horror becomes terrifying only when human beings are forced into impossible situations. And perhaps no impossible situation feels more devastating than this: losing someone you love, then watching them come back, different. In 2026, Lee Cronin's The Mummy appears to transform one of horror's oldest names into something emotionally brutal. Not treasure hunting, not giant action scenes, not heroic adventure. Instead, a deeply personal nightmare, a family horror tragedy driven by grief, loss, psychological destruction, and the terrifying possibility that the people we love most can slowly become strangers. At the center of the story, a missing daughter, gone for years, believed lost forever. Then suddenly, she returns, alive. But something feels wrong. Cold, ancient, unfamiliar. And slowly, the family begins falling apart again. But to truly understand The Mummy, 2026, we must understand its characters, because horror stories don't work without emotional foundations. Fear only matters when we care about the people suffering. Tonight, we are breaking down the characters of The Mummy, 2026. Their hidden motivations, psychological struggles, emotional damage, and the terrifying truth behind what each person may secretly represent. Because sometimes, the most dangerous monster in a horror story is grief itself. Chapter 1. The Daughter, Victim or Monster? Let's begin with the most terrifying character of all, the returned daughter. At first glance, she appears to be the victim, a child who disappeared, a survivor, someone who endured unimaginable suffering, someone deserving love, protection, healing, and emotionally, that instinct feels natural. The audience wants her to be okay. The family desperately needs her to be okay. But horror stories thrive in emotional contradiction, because the daughter may simultaneously be victim and horror. That contradiction makes her terrifying. Think about what disappearance means psychologically. 8 years alone, 8 years lost, 8 years surviving impossible circumstances. No human being survives that unchanged. Trauma reshapes people, emotionally, mentally, physically. Even without supernatural horror, the daughter would already feel different, more distant, less familiar, harder to understand. And that realism becomes frightening, because the family wants the old version back. The smiling child, the innocent daughter, the memory they preserved. But memory lies. People change. Time changes everyone. Now add supernatural horror to that emotional reality. Something ancient, something cursed, something unnatural. Suddenly, the daughter becomes horrifyingly complicated. Maybe she remembers who she once was. Maybe she fights against transformation. Maybe moments of humanity still survive inside her. Tiny glimpses, small emotional cracks, moments where the real daughter briefly returns, only to disappear again. That possibility becomes emotionally devastating, because now, the audience experiences something cruel. Hope, false hope, and horror becomes stronger whenever hope exists. Because if there's still humanity inside her, then saving her feels possible. But horror rarely rewards hope. Sometimes, it weaponizes it. Chapter 2. The Mother, the Psychology of Denial. In family horror, mothers often become emotional anchors. The protector, the believer, the person refusing to give up. And in The Mummy, the mother may secretly become one of the film's most tragic characters. Why? Because grief changes mothers differently. Psychologically, many grieving parents develop overwhelming guilt. Questions become obsession. Could I have stopped it? Did I fail? Should I have protected them better? These thoughts become permanent, especially after disappearance, because uncertainty destroys emotional stability. No closure, no final goodbye, only endless imagination, and imagination becomes torture. 4 years. The mother likely survives through hope. Hope the daughter still exists somewhere. Hope she might come back. Hope the nightmare isn't permanent. Then suddenly, the impossible happens. Her daughter returns. Alive. Emotionally. That changes everything. The mother doesn't want questions. She wants healing, which makes denial dangerous, because love blinds people, especially parental love. Maybe warning signs appear immediately. Strange behavior, emotional distance, coldness, fear. But denial protects her. She's traumatized. She just needs time. She's still my daughter. That emotional blindness becomes tragic, because the more terrifying things become, the harder acceptance feels. Why? Because accepting truth means losing her daughter again, and losing someone twice can emotionally destroy a person. That psychological conflict may become the emotional heart of the movie. Love fighting reality, hope fighting fear, memory fighting truth, and tragedy becoming unavoidable. Chapter 3. The Father. Guilt, fear and emotional collapse. If the mother symbolizes denial, the father may symbolize fear. Because grief often affects parents differently. Where one parent clings to hope, the other becomes practical, suspicious, emotionally withdrawn, perhaps even broken. 4 years. The father likely carried guilt, the unbearable kind, silent guilt, the kind nobody talks about. Maybe he blames himself for the disappearance. Maybe he failed to protect her. Maybe grief destroyed his confidence, his relationships, his identity. Then suddenly, his daughter returns. But instead of relief, something feels wrong. Fathers often notice danger differently. Protective instinct changes perception. He notices behavior shifts, coldness, unfamiliar reactions, the strange feeling that someone familiar suddenly feels unknown. And perhaps, he becomes the first person willing to admit terrifying truth. Something isn't right. But truth creates conflict. Because now, he risks becoming the villain of the family, the one questioning the miracle, the one creating fear, the one refusing hope. And emotionally, that isolates him. Because how do you tell grieving people something horrifying? How do you say, I don't think that's our daughter anymore? Now we explain Part 9. Every horror story has a timeline, a chain of events, a beginning, a middle, and a terrifying end. But the most disturbing horror films, the ones that stay inside your mind, often hide their truth beneath fragmented events, moments that feel disconnected, clues audiences overlook, details that only make sense after everything falls apart. And Lee Cronin's The Mummy, 2026, appears built exactly like that, because this isn't simply a story about an ancient curse, or a supernatural monster, or even resurrection. This is a timeline of emotional destruction, a story where grief slowly mutates into horror, where love becomes dangerous, and where one impossible event destroys everything that remained. At first, the story seems simple. A child disappears. Years pass. She returns. Something feels wrong. Terror begins. But beneath that simplicity, a far darker sequence may be unfolding, because every moment in The Mummy appears connected. Every silence, every strange behavior, every emotional fracture, every horrifying transformation, and perhaps most terrifying of all, the horror may have started long before the daughter came home. Tonight, we are breaking down the complete timeline of The Mummy, 2026. From the moment tragedy begins, to the terrifying consequences of bringing the past back home. Because sometimes, horror doesn't arrive suddenly. Sometimes, it grows slowly, until escape becomes impossible. Chapter 1. Before the horror, the family before loss. Every tragedy begins with normal life. That matters, because horror feels stronger when happiness existed first. Before fear, before grief, before disappearance, there was family, ordinary life, morning conversations, shared meals, laughter, arguments too small to matter. The daughter likely becomes the emotional center of everything. Children often do. Families orbit around them. Future plans depend on them. Parents dream through them, protect them, build meaning around them. And because of that emotional connection, loss becomes devastating. But horror stories understand something terrifying. People rarely recognize happiness while living inside it, only after losing it. And perhaps that ordinary life becomes important later, because memory turns happiness into pain. The happier life once felt, the more unbearable grief becomes. Meaning, the family was already doomed emotionally. The moment disappearance arrived. Chapter 2. Day 0, the disappearance. Then comes the day everything ends. The moment time breaks. The daughter disappears into the desert. Gone. Without warning. Without explanation. One ordinary moment. Life exists normally. The next, nothing makes sense. And that suddenness creates trauma. Because trauma often begins with confusion. Nobody immediately understands what happened. At first, there's panic, searches, phone calls, authorities, hope. People still believe she'll be found. Hours pass, then days, then weeks, and slowly, fear begins replacing hope. The desert becomes terrifying, not simply because it is dangerous, but because it swallows certainty. No answers, no body, no explanation, only absence. And absence creates obsession, because the human brain cannot tolerate uncertainty. The family likely begins replaying every moment endlessly. What happened? What did we miss? Could this have been prevented? Did someone fail her? And guilt enters the story. Guilt always enters tragedy, especially for parents, because parents blame themselves even when reality gives no reason. And over time, the disappearance becomes more than loss. It becomes psychological destruction. Chapter 3, Year 1, When Hope Becomes Torture. The first year after disappearance is often the cruelest, because hope still exists, and hope hurts. Every phone call feels important. Every rumor matters. Every possible sighting creates emotional chaos. Families stay trapped between belief and despair. Emotionally, nobody moves forward. Life pauses. Time feels distorted. Holidays become painful. Birthdays feel unbearable. Silence grows heavier. The daughter's room likely remains untouched. Clothes preserved. Photos untouched. Objects frozen in time. Because changing anything feels like betrayal. Letting go feels cruel. Almost disrespectful. And perhaps this becomes the first emotional curse of the story. The family stops healing. Instead, they preserve grief, protect it, feed it, live beside it, and slowly, pain becomes identity. Chapter 4, Years 2 to 8, The Slow Destruction of a Family. This may be the darkest section of the timeline, because horror doesn't always happen suddenly. Sometimes, it happens quietly, over years. The family begins emotionally collapsing, not dramatically, slowly, one relationship at a time. Maybe arguments increase, maybe silence replaces conversation, maybe blame quietly enters the home. People grieve differently, and different grief often creates emotional distance. The mother may cling to hope, refusing acceptance, still believing, still waiting, still emotionally connected to memory. The father may become colder, withdrawn, broken, protecting himself emotionally, perhaps even afraid to hope anymore. Friends move on. Communities stop asking questions. The missing daughter becomes history, a tragedy people whisper about. But for the family, nothing ends. Emotionally, time remains frozen. And perhaps that emotional freezing becomes important later, because psychologically, the family never buried grief, never accepted reality, never truly said goodbye, which means the wound stayed open, waiting. Chapter 5, Year 8, The Impossible Return. Then suddenly, the impossible happens. Without warning, the daughter returns. Alive. 8 years later. No explanation. No logic. No clear story. Just return. And emotionally, everything explodes. Imagine that moment. Shock. Disbelief. Relief. Fear. Joy. Confusion. Every emotion crashing together. The impossible miracle finally arrives. The child they lost, standing in front of them again, alive. But horror stories understand something terrifying. Miracles feel dangerous, especially impossible ones, because reality rarely gives back what it takes, not without consequences. At first, questions may disappear beneath emotion. Nobody wants answers. Nobody wants logic. They only want happiness, healing, family, hope. But slowly, tiny cracks begin appearing. Something feels wrong. Small details, behavior shifts, uncomfortable silences, unnatural reactions. Familiarity begins disappearing. Part 10. Why this movie could redefine modern monster cinema. Every generation gets its version of horror. A monster. A nightmare. A story that reflects the fears of its time. In older eras, people feared curses, ancient gods, the unknown. Later, horror became psychological. Isolation, trauma, mental collapse, family destruction. And now, modern horror often asks a terrifying question. What if the real monster is emotional pain? In 2026, director Lee Cronin appears ready to transform one of horror cinema's oldest names into something disturbingly modern. The Mummy. But not the version audiences grew up expecting. No larger-than-life heroes. No globe-spanning action. No treasure hunters fighting supernatural warriors. Instead, something darker. Something intimate. Something painfully human. A child disappears. Years pass. Grief destroys a family. Then suddenly, the impossible happens. The daughter returns. Alive. But wrong. Different. As if something ancient followed her home. And what begins as miracle slowly mutates into nightmare. But here's the terrifying truth. The Mummy, 2026, may secretly be doing something much bigger than telling a horror story. It may be reinventing what monster films actually mean. Tonight, we are diving deep into the horror behind The Mummy, 2026. Why this movie feels different, how it may redefine classic monster storytelling, its hidden emotional horror, and why audiences may leave the theater disturbed for reasons they never expected. Because sometimes, the scariest monsters don't attack cities, they destroy families. Chapter 1. Why classic monster movies stopped feeling scary. To understand why The Mummy, 2026, feels important, we first need to understand horror itself. Monster movies used to terrify audiences. Back in the early days of cinema, classic creatures felt terrifying. Mummies, vampires, werewolves, Frankenstein's monster, because they represented fear of the unknown, ancient curses, death, science gone wrong, humanity losing control. But over time, something changed. Audiences adapted. Familiar monsters stopped feeling frightening. Instead, they became entertainment, adventure, nostalgia, spectacle, especially The Mummy. For many audiences, the title immediately brings memories of action-adventure stories. Deserts, treasure, ancient tombs, explosions, heroes outrunning supernatural chaos. Fun, exciting, but not deeply terrifying. And perhaps that's exactly why Lee Cronin's version matters. Because instead of repeating familiar formulas, he appears to ask a much darker question. What made The Mummy scary in the first place? Not action, not spectacle, but resurrection, the fear of dead things returning. And suddenly, the horror becomes personal again. Chapter 2. The Return of Intimate Horror. Modern horror works differently than older horror. Instead of giant monsters destroying cities, it focuses on emotional devastation, families breaking apart, trauma, grief, psychological collapse. That shift changed horror forever, because audiences fear emotional realism more than fantasy. A giant monster feels fictional. Family suffering feels real. And The Mummy, 2026, seems built entirely around emotional realism. Think about the premise. A missing child returns after years. At first, that sounds miraculous. Hope, healing, second chances. But horror flips emotion upside down. The daughter returns, yet something feels wrong, and instantly, the story transforms, not into adventure, into discomfort. Fear enters ordinary life. Dinner tables become tense. Bedrooms feel unsettling. Conversations feel strange. Silence becomes threatening. That intimacy creates devastating horror, because audiences understand family pain. They understand grief, loss, fear of change, fear of losing someone emotionally. And suddenly, the horror feels believable, which makes it infinitely scarier. Chapter 3: Why the Monster is Emotional. The smartest horror films hide monsters inside metaphor, meaning the creature represents something deeper: fear, addiction, depression, trauma, guilt, and perhaps The Mummy, 2026, hides its real monster inside grief. Think about grief. Grief behaves like haunting. It follows people, changes homes, destroys relationships, turns ordinary memories painful, makes people emotionally frozen, and perhaps most importantly, grief never fully disappears. It waits, dormant, silent, then suddenly returns, sometimes years later, unexpectedly, overwhelmingly. Now think about the daughter, gone for years, then suddenly back, changed, unfamiliar, emotionally unsettling, almost like grief itself became physical, standing in front of the family, demanding attention, demanding confrontation. That symbolism feels terrifying, because suddenly, the movie stops being about ancient curses and starts becoming emotionally universal. Everyone understands loss. Everyone fears losing people. Everyone understands change. And perhaps that emotional truth becomes the real horror. Chapter 4: Why the family dynamic makes everything worse. Traditional monster movies create clear enemies. Monster bad, heroes good. Simple. But emotionally devastating horror works differently. There are no simple villains, only suffering. And in The Mummy, the family itself may become emotionally fractured. Years of grief likely damaged everyone differently. The mother may refuse reality, desperate to believe the daughter truly returned, emotionally unable to survive another loss. The father may become suspicious, protective, afraid, feeling something deeply wrong. And the daughter, caught somewhere between victim and horror. That emotional conflict creates devastating tension, because now, nobody agrees. Nobody understands each other. Love becomes painful. Trust disappears. Fear grows quietly. And horror enters the home, not through violence, but through emotional breakdown. That psychological realism feels brutal, because many families already struggle under grief, which means audiences may see painful truth reflected on screen. And painful truth always feels scarier than fantasy. Chapter 5: Why this version of The Mummy feels so different. This version feels different because it refuses comfort. Older interpretations gave audiences excitement, adventure, heroes, escapism. But this film appears interested in discomfort, slow dread, emotional pain, moral confusion, and uncertainty, because uncertainty creates fear. Questions become terrifying. Is the daughter dangerous? Can she be saved? Is she still human? What really happened in the desert? Did something ancient survive inside her? Now we explain Part 11, Dark Secrets Explained, the hidden horror nobody saw coming. Every horror story hides secrets, but the darkest horror films hide truths so disturbing, most audiences don't notice them until it's already too late, because fear works best when it grows slowly, quietly, patiently, like something buried beneath the surface, waiting. And perhaps no horror symbol captures that idea better than the mummy. Something ancient, something forgotten, something hidden, something that should have stayed buried forever. But in 2026, director Lee Cronin appears ready to transform that idea into something deeply unsettling. Not an adventure, not treasure hunting, not giant blockbuster spectacle. Instead, a cold, personal, emotionally devastating nightmare. A daughter disappears. Years pass. A family collapses beneath grief. Then suddenly, the impossible happens. The child returns, alive, standing in front of them, breathing, speaking, home again. At first, it feels like hope, a miracle. The nightmare finally ending, but slowly, very slowly, something changes. Her behavior feels unfamiliar. Her emotions feel distant. The house feels colder. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Fear quietly enters ordinary life. And eventually, the family begins asking a terrifying question. What if the child who came home isn't really the child they lost? Tonight, we are uncovering the dark secrets behind The Mummy, 2026. The hidden horror beneath the story. The disturbing clues audiences may overlook. The emotional symbolism buried inside grief. And why this film may secretly be far darker than anyone expects. Because sometimes, the real terror is not what comes back. It's realizing something never truly returned at all. Chapter 1. The First Secret. The horror may have started before the disappearance. Most audiences will probably assume the horror begins in the desert. The disappearance, the mystery, the return. Simple. But what if the real horror started long before any of that? Great horror stories often hide emotional cracks early. Small fractures, tiny emotional wounds, things that feel ordinary at first, but later become devastating, because horror thrives inside weakness, inside vulnerability, inside emotional instability. Think about the family. No family is perfect. Maybe tension already existed. Arguments, distance, stress, unspoken resentment, parenting struggles, emotional exhaustion, small problems nobody addresses. Then tragedy arrives, and those cracks become destruction. Because grief magnifies everything, silence grows louder. Old wounds reopen. Blame enters relationships. Fear changes personalities. And suddenly, the family stops functioning as a family. They become survivors. Emotionally exhausted survivors. That detail matters. Because by the time the daughter returns, the family is already psychologically vulnerable, already fractured, already desperate, which makes manipulation easier, whether supernatural or emotional. And perhaps that vulnerability becomes the first hidden horror of the story. Chapter 2. The return itself may be the biggest warning sign. Let's talk about something terrifying. The return makes no sense. That sounds obvious. But emotionally, people ignore impossible things when hope becomes involved. Think about it. A child disappears for 8 years. No answers. No evidence. No explanation. Then suddenly, she returns. Alive. healthy enough to survive. No logical story. No clear explanation. Just return. Realistically, that alone should terrify everyone. But grief changes logic. The family doesn't want questions. They want healing, closure, love, second chances, which creates blindness. Emotion becomes stronger than reason, and horror thrives in emotional blindness. Maybe strange details